one of the best shows I've seen in the last few years, for reasons that, are quite difficult to explain, but I'll have a go, is Borders. An incredibly funny comedy about 5 black teenagers being removed from quite difficult inner city scenario into a school that was very like mine, except that it had girls in it, into a posh school. David Lawrence Taylor is the genius behind that program, and he will be joining us in the next half an hour as well. But before all of that, Natasha Clark is here, and it wasn't a vintage episode of PMQs.
No, it's a bit meh. It's okay. Last one before recess, so trying to tick off as many topics as possible.
Yes, and I know that you and Eleanor felt that I was speaking out of turn when I pointed out that we'd correctly circled the same territory with our topic selection today. But it is, I think, interesting that Starmer has elected not to do what the EU is doing, not to talk about retaliation, and instead, for the time being at least, to try to have his cake and eat it, to try and keep the door open to a deal, even with someone as unpredictable and unhelpful as Donald Trump, and describe it as pragmatism, as taking it as keeping calm.
Yeah, and we'll see what approach works soon enough, won't we? Because we saw what happened with Canada when, they doubled down and Donald Trump eventually did back off on escalating that tariff war. Is that the approach that's going to happen with the EU? Or is Keir Starmer's approach with, trying to appease Donald Trump the safer way to go? And, you're talking about your original point about the tech bros and who we're sort of appeasing to, aren't we? Let's be honest, by having these discussions about digital services tax and what might impact them and what might not. Is that an appeasement, or is it worth it to avoid crippling tariffs?
Both?
Well, it can be both, yeah.
That's
totally
the thing,
both.
that we're so used to quite binary politics.
Yeah, but is it worth it?
Yeah.
I think, potentially to save 22,000 jobs, billions of pounds being wiped off the economy, a 1% hit to our GDP, is it worth it? And I think, potentially, yeah.
And that is where we move into Mussolini made the trains run on time territory. How bad does a regime have to be before you do not brook any question of breaking bread or doing deals with them, which is why today's topic selection was so good. So I can't believe that you and Eleanor were poo-pooing.
No, it was a great topic selection.
Thank you.
Well done.
Yeah.
But,
traitor.
like everyone.
See, she's hung you out to dry, Eleanor.
That's not true. I'm very much on Eleanor's side in
So
all
what
matters.
else? What else came up today?
But yeah, look, national insurance, awful April bills, tariffs, trade, Birmingham council tax, fiscal rules, inflation, trade deals, lots of topics trying to cover. Like I say, I think Kemi Badenoch is quite strong when she goes on the economy because they've got a bit of a better record to sell a little bit at the end of their time, that inflation down, economy slightly on the up, but now looks like inflation's going to tick up again, looks like growth is going to be on the floor again, and the string of bills that are going up in April, that is going to be a problem for Keir Starmer when he heads into these local elections, because people, as we know, tend to vote with their wallets, and if people are feeling worse off in the next couple of weeks, it's really going to hammer Labour at the polls. And I think it was going to hammer Labour at the polls anyway, but I think it's going to be even worse than
the harder they're hit, the harder the hammer. Although Tim in Stourbridge is at great pains to point out, quite correctly, I think, that this repetition of points about the fastest growing G7 economy is contingent upon it having risen from the lowest point in the G7. So in percentage terms, if you grow from 10 to 100, that's 1,000% growth. But if you start at 50 and then grow to 100, that's only 100% growth. So you can claim that you've got the fastest growth in the Johnson used to do this all the time. But in fact, it's because you're coming at it, especially after the pandemic, from the lowest point of all your rivals in that grouping as well.
I'll revise down my comments that she had a good legacy to it was the best legacy that one of the only legacies the Conservative Party can draw from 14 years in office, that they can point to and go, wasn't that bad. I think there's few of those levers that she can pull, and every week we hear her trying to batter Keir Starmer over the head with some point or other, but there's very few things she can reach to the Conservative record to say, well, actually it was all right, and that was one of the ones that's okay.
And every week we come back to the same question of how effectively and for how long can Keir, regardless of accuracy, because it's correct when he points it out, how often can he point to the inheritance? How often can he point to what I mean, everywhere really, from the NHS to the police and everywhere in between. How often can he point out that they're trying to, what's the phrase? The black hole. Didn't used this
mention the
week.
word
Mick's
black
playing a
hole.
drinking game. He's still stone cold sober.
Oh,
he didn't get a single shot this week.
Does it count if we
on
say
the
it?
black hole? He wants us to.
Black
He
hole,
wants
black
us to
hole.
join in on
Okay.
the drinking game, but I think that's against Ofcom rules.
What about with tea? Is it fine with tea?
But yes, maybe. How long does it? Yeah, I mean that's the question, isn't it? And does it work with the electorate?
I think
how long are their memories?
I spoke to someone in government earlier today who agrees that is a topic that resonates with the public, the idea of the terrible inheritance. And actually it works in some departments better than others. Like, for example, the DWP, you can point to them and say, well, actually under the Tories, the welfare bill spiralled and now we're having to clear that mess up. And I think that's an argument that hasn't really been made enough about these welfare cuts, right? Because you basically are able to blame the last government for making it so that more people than ever are claiming these benefits than ever before. And it should be very easy to blame the last government. But the person I was speaking to also said that the British public are more impatient than they've potentially ever been before. And that there's not enough time for them to do things and to do things at the speed that they want to do them at. Another point I wanted to make was that Kemi's language I thought was really interesting today. She keeps mentioning words like the economy being vulnerable and fragile. I think that kind of works, actually, that sort of argument of stability versus fragility. Keir Starmer keeps saying that he wants to stabilise the public finances, that he's come in to sort everything out. And actually, the reality is that in the economy, in many areas of public life, in our public services, things for many people still do feel quite fragile. And I think she can tap into that as a bit of a sore spot for the Prime Minister. And I think if she uses words like that and that sort of language and that narrative, I think that could quite work for her.
I suppose, alternatively, it could also add this toing and froing over whose fault it all is. It could also add to the narrative I find very unhelpful, but it's popular. They're all as bad as each other, which is good news for Nigel Farage and his mates. Of course, so hard to keep up with who his mates currently are. They're 4 MPs at the moment, or 5?
4. Yeah, exactly. Week to week depends who his friends are. But it does, and that's bad for British politics if you think they're all the same and it's just two sides fighting.
Which brings us to Ed Davey, who
exactly.
is not the same, and who unfortunately only gets attention in some corners of the media. You, of course, were on this programme with a very interesting interview with Ed Davey just a couple of weeks ago, but some corners of the media only really notice his existence when he starts prancing around in his speedos or dancing around on a hobby horse. Good questions this week again, and he's an interesting politician. He's not a cookie cutter politician. No. He's sometimes very statesmanlike in a context of PMQs, which is often anything but.
Yeah, and the way that he asks his questions are really, I think he's such a statesman and an experienced politician that he knows exactly how to ask a question that's going to get people to sit up and pay attention. And that's exactly what Keir Starmer did when he said the words, are you going to build an economic coalition of the willing like you've done so for defence? And that's a really interesting way of putting it into ball into his court. Well, you're standing by the EU on Ukraine, you're standing with Canada. Why aren't you standing with them on trade? And that's going to be a question that's going to potentially make life incredibly awkward for Keir Starmer going forward, because if that starts to rub some of our friends and allies up the wrong way, well, why aren't you standing with your oldest friends? And, the person who you have the biggest trading relationship with, the EU, you're completely going in a different direction from us. So that could make
So you go from trying to have your cake and eat it to
upsetting the other person.
Yes.
You end up, you can't be a bridge.
Whatever the opposite of having your cake and eating it is.
Yeah, having no cake at all.
Cake and not
no
eating
cake.
it.
Keir Starmer wants to be the bridge, but he's going to fall in between the cracks.
It's a really good point. And I have to tell you, I know it's only anecdotal, but more and more people are expressing profound frustration, and it speaks to part of Ed Davey's question about the utter failure ever to mention Brexit when Keir Starmer is talking about economic problems or inheritances or black holes. And for people lucky enough not to have to pay full attention to this day in, day out like we do, it is increasingly mystifying.
I think he doesn't want to upset a chunk of the electorate
Ever.
which still believe that that's the right way to go, even though most of the polling shows that a lot of people have changed their minds about it. But I just think he doesn't want to open up that can of worms right now. But eventually it will inevitably open up when he starts these negotiations over redoing a trade negotiation with the EU. So these conversations are coming. Keir Starmer can't avoid them forever. He is going to have to at some point deal up to them. But it's a bit of an easy lever to pull, isn't it?
Of course it is.
To say, or just blame Brexit for everything, when actually it's the fault of many of our politicians. And isn't it easier to blame the Conservatives? Isn't it a nicer political argument to go, well, it's actually all of their fault, rather than blame the people that voted
blame
for
Brexit,
them.
you're blaming the voters, you're right.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so this is easier to say blame Kemi Badenoch and her party instead.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, Natasha. Anything else?
I like the way that Ed Davey asked that last question about Thames Water. That was really interesting. That's something that the Keir Starmer, obviously campaigned on. He's going to clean up our rivers.
Yeah.
They allowed it. He shouldn't. He's very punchy, isn't he? Ed Davey can be very, very punchy when he wants to be, when he can get very angry and very emotive on issues that he really cares about. Sewage, carers, Israel. I thought Israel might come up for Ed Davey.
I did as well. I thought that's where he was going to go with the coalition of the willing, actually. But,
Interesting.
But they went down the economy line
Maybe next week. Well, we'll see you in 2-3 weeks.
Yes, indeedy. Thank you, Natasha.